My friends, there are certain statements in Scripture that appear so simple that the world passes over them without pause. They are read aloud, memorized, quoted, preached upon, and yet never entered. One such statement stands at the very heart of the Christ revelation, and it is this: I can of mine own self do nothing. These words have been spoken by millions of lips, but they have been realized by very few hearts. Now let us be clear at the outset. This statement is not humility in the human sense. It is not resignation. It is not weakness. It is not an admission of limitation. And above all, it is not a confession that man is powerless and must therefore wait helplessly for God to act. If we hear it that way, we have not heard it at all. The reason this teaching is so rarely understood is because it cannot be grasped by the human intellect. The human mind immediately translates it into its own language. I must do less. I must try harder to surrender. I must learn not to interfere. And yet every one of those conclusions leaves the personal sense of self firmly seated on the throne. The human I is still present, only now it is attempting to be spiritual. But Jesus was not speaking as a man attempting to become God. He was speaking as the Christ, revealing the nature of reality itself. When he said, I can of mine own self do nothing, he was not referring to inability. He was revealing identity. He was announcing that there is only one actor, one doer, one power, and that this power is God appearing as individual being. Scripture tells us, not by might, nor by power, but by my Spirit, saith the Lord. And again, be still and know that I am God. These are not poetic comforts. They are exact spiritual laws. They tell us that the activity of God is never released through effort, never expressed through strain, and never contacted through human will. God is known only in stillness, and God acts only where the false sense of a personal doer has been relinquished. Now observe this carefully. The world believes that power comes through effort. Religion often believes that power comes through obedience. Metaphysics frequently believes that power comes through right thinking. But the Christ teaching reveals something far more radical. Power is not achieved at all. It is recognized. And recognition does not belong to the personal self. Recognition occurs only when the personal self has stepped aside. The tragedy is that most spiritual seekers take this sacred statement, I can of mine own self do nothing, and turn it into a new form of self-improvement. They try to practice it. They attempt to remember it. They discipline themselves into surrender. And in doing so, they unknowingly strengthen the very sense of self that must dissolve if God is to be revealed. Let us be honest. The human mind wants to do something spiritually. It wants a method, a process, a way to succeed. But the Christ does not offer a method. The Christ offers an ending of the belief that there is a self apart from God that can act, decide, initiate, or control life. This is why Jesus could say without contradiction, the Father that dwelleth in me, he doeth the works. Notice he does not say, the Father helps me, or the Father empowers me, or the Father works through me when I am obedient. He says plainly, he doeth the works. The personal sense of I has vanished. There is no partnership here. There is no cooperation between God and man. There is only God expressing himself as man. And until this is understood, not intellectually, but inwardly, spiritual life remains a struggle. Prayer becomes effort. Meditation becomes discipline. Faith becomes willpower. And all the while, the individual wonders why peace remains elusive, why healing seems uncertain, and why God feels distant. The answer is simple, though not easy to accept. The wrong I is trying to live the spiritual life. So we begin here not with instruction, not with technique, but with quiet discernment. We begin by questioning the very sense of self that claims to be the doer. We begin by listening not for guidance, not for answers, but for the still, small realization that there is only one life, one mind, one actor, and that this life is what we are. When this dawns, even faintly, the words, "I can of mine own self do nothing," cease to be a statement of limitation. They become a benediction. They mark the end of struggle and the beginning of grace. Now let us go a little deeper, for here lies one of the most subtle and destructive misunderstandings in the entire spiritual life. When men and women first encounter the statement, "I can of mine own self do nothing," they almost invariably hear it as a verdict against themselves. They conclude, often unconsciously, that they are weak, inadequate, incapable, and that spirituality therefore requires them to withdraw from life, suppress initiative, or resign themselves to circumstance. Nothing could be further from the truth. This misunderstanding arises because the human mind assumes that the statement is addressed to it. But the Christ never speaks to the human mind. The Christ speaks through it. The words are not condemning the individual. They are dissolving a false premise about individuality. They are not saying, "You are nothing." They are saying, "You were never meant to be the doer." Observe how quickly the personal sense of self takes offense. It hears, "I can do nothing," and immediately replies, "Then what is left of me? Where is my value? Where is my responsibility?" And so religion steps in and tries to soften the blow by teaching humility, submission, obedience. Metaphysics steps in and tries to correct it by saying, "You can do nothing without God." But Jesus never said that. He did not say, "I can do nothing unless God helps me." He said, "The Father that dwelleth in me, he doeth the works." This is not partnership. This is replacement. The personal sense of self wants to remain intact, even if it must bow low. It would rather be a humble servant than not exist at all. And so it invents a counterfeit surrender. I surrender my will to God. But who is surrendering? The very self that claims to be powerless is still claiming authorship of surrender. This is why so much spiritual practice exhausts rather than liberates. Scripture warns us of this subtle trap when it says, "Having begun in the Spirit, are ye now made perfect by the flesh?" We begin with a glimpse of grace, but then attempt to complete the work through personal effort. We hear that God is the doer, but we continue to behave as if we must manage outcomes, protect ourselves, and ensure results, only now with religious language attached. Let us be very clear. The Christ teaching does not reduce life. It removes a burden. It does not diminish activity. It eliminates anxiety. When the belief in a personal doer collapses, action does not stop. It becomes effortless. Life does not become passive. It becomes precise. There is movement, decision, speech, and work, but none of it originates in fear. Jesus never hesitated, never delayed, never appeared uncertain, yet never once did he attribute action to himself. I seek not mine own will, but the will of the Father which hath sent me. This does not mean that Jesus waited for instructions like a servant, awaiting orders. It means that there was no private agenda operating within him. There was no personal will to consult. Here is where the universal mistake must be corrected. Surrender is not something you do to yourself. Surrender is what happens when the false assumption of separation is seen through. The moment you realize that there never was a personal power to begin with, surrender is complete. Not dramatic, not emotional, simply final. This is why those who try hardest to surrender are often the most fatigued spiritually. They are still trying to do what can only occur through realization. They are like a man attempting to relax by effort, or a sleeper trying to fall asleep through willpower. The harder they try, the more elusive peace becomes. The Christ revelation does not ask you to become nothing. It reveals that you are already everything because God is all. In him we live and move and have our being. Notice, we do not live alongside God. We do not move with God. We live in him. Our being is not ours at all. When this is understood, even slightly, the sense of personal defeat vanishes. There is no one left to be defeated. And in that absence, something extraordinary is felt, not weakness, but rest. Not resignation, but quiet confidence. Not dependence, but freedom. The human self has spent a lifetime carrying a burden it was never designed to carry. And when the Christ says, I can of mine own self do nothing, he is not condemning that self, he is releasing it. Now we must come to the heart of the matter, for until this point is discerned, all spiritual teaching remains confusing, and much of it becomes contradictory. When Jesus said, I can of mine own self do nothing, we must ask, who is this I? For Scripture uses that word in more than one way, and the failure to distinguish between them has produced centuries of misunderstanding. There is the personal sense of I, the one that was born, educated, trained, praised, blamed, and burdened with responsibility. This I plans, worries, strives, and defends. It says, I must succeed. I must be careful. I must make the right decision. This is the I the world knows, and this is the I religion and psychology address. But there is another I, and this one is not personal. This is the I that Scripture reveals when it declares, before Abraham was, I am. This I has no history, no age, no condition, no opposite. It is not a self trying to become spiritual. It is spirit, itself conscious as being. This I does not act, it is. And because it is, all right action flows from it without effort. The tragedy is that most people hear Jesus' words as if he were speaking from the personal I. They imagine him saying, I, Jesus the man, am powerless. And then they attempt to imitate this supposed humility. But Jesus was never speaking as a man attempting to obey God. He was revealing the nature of divine sonship, the state in which the personal sense of I has dissolved into the awareness of God as being. Scripture tells us, I am the vine, ye are the branches. A branch does not struggle to produce fruit. It does not decide when to blossom. It does not worry about supply. It simply abides in the vine, and fruit appears as a natural consequence. The branch that tries to act independently withers not because it is punished, but because it has accepted a false sense of separation. So when Jesus says, I can of mine own self do nothing, he is not denying power, he is denying separation. He is saying, in effect, there is no mine own self apart from the Father, and this is why he can also say, without contradiction, all power is given unto me. The power is not personal, it is divine, and it flows where there is no obstruction of selfhood. Now, observe this carefully. The personal I is the only I that struggles. The spiritual I never struggles because it has no opposite. The personal I is always seeking health, seeking security, seeking purpose. The spiritual I is complete and therefore rests. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Want belongs only to the personal sense of self. This is why spiritual practice does not begin with improving the personal I. It begins with seeing through it, not condemning it, not fighting it, not suppressing it, but recognizing that it was never the actor in the first place. When this is seen, even dimly, a great relief comes over the soul. The weight of authorship drops away. You may notice, at such moments, that decisions are made without anxiety, that words come without rehearsal, that solutions appear without being hunted. This is not magic. It is simply the removal of the false claimant to power. The personal I steps aside, and the true I is revealed as the activity of God. This is why the Christ teaching never asks, what should I do? It asks, who is doing? When the answer is I, the personal self, confusion follows. When the answer is the Father that dwelleth in me, there is peace even before circumstances change. And let us be clear, this does not annihilate individuality, it fulfills it. The fear that one will become empty, passive, or indistinct is unfounded. What disappears is not individuality, but isolation. What vanishes is not being, but burden. The true self is not lost, it is found. He that loseth his life for my sake shall find it. So we do not practice becoming the spiritual I. We recognize that it is what we have always been. The moment this recognition dawns, the statement, I can of mine own self do nothing, is no longer heard as limitation. It is heard as liberation. It announces that the false I has no assignment, and the true I has never failed. Now we come to a point that is both revealing and, for many, unsettling. If you wish to know which I is governing your life at any moment, you need not look far. You need only observe the presence or absence of effort. Effort is the unmistakable sign that the personal sense of I has assumed control. It is the signal flare announcing that the wrong self is at work. This does not mean activity ceases when God is the doer. It means strain ceases. It means anxiety ceases. It means the inner compulsion to force an outcome disappears. Scripture gives us a precise measure when it says, the peace of God, which passeth all understanding, shall keep your hearts and minds. Peace is not the reward for success. Peace is the evidence that God is acting where there is effort, there is fear. And where there is fear, there is a belief in separation. The personal self believes it must protect itself, provide for itself, heal itself, and guide itself. It feels alone in a vast world of conditions and chances. And so it strains, It plans excessively. It rehearses. It anticipates danger. It tries to get ahead of life. All of this is effort, and all of it arises from a false premise. Jesus never said, "By your effort you shall know that God is at work." He said, "Take no thought for your life." And again, which of you by taking thought can add 1 cubit unto his stature? He was not advocating irresponsibility. He was revealing futility. The personal self cannot add, cannot secure, cannot create life, no matter how sincere its efforts. This is why spiritual effort is often the most exhausting of all. A person may give up worldly striving only to take on religious striving. They may stop chasing success, but begin chasing realization. They sit in meditation and strain to be still. They pray and labor to believe. They repeat truths and work to make them effective. And all the while, peace remains just out of reach. Why? Because effort itself is the barrier. The Christ does not enter consciousness through pressure. The activity of God is gentle, quiet, and sure. Elijah discovered this when the wind tore the mountains and the fire raged, but the Lord was not in them. And only after the earthquake and the fire passed did he hear the still, small voice. God was not absent during the turmoil. He was simply unrecognized. Let us be exact. Effort is not wrong. It is simply unnecessary in the realm of spirit. Effort belongs to the world of objects, mechanisms, and personal control. But the life of spirit is not constructed. It is revealed. Except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. This is not a warning, it is a diagnosis. When the wrong I is at work, even spiritual ideas become burdens. Truth becomes something to apply, maintain, or defend. And this is why many sincere students grow weary and wonder why the joy they glimpsed at the beginning seems to fade. They have unknowingly returned authorship to the personal self. But when the true I is recognized even momentarily, effort dissolves without instruction. There is a natural relaxation, not into passivity, but into trust. Action continues, but it is no longer driven. Decisions occur, but they are not rehearsed. Speech comes, but it is not premeditated. And often one is surprised afterward at the simplicity of what has been done. This is the meaning of "my yoke is easy and my burden is light." The yoke is not removed, it is replaced. The heavy yoke of personal responsibility gives way to the light yoke of divine activity. The burden was never life itself, it was the belief that life was ours to manage. So whenever you find yourself straining, pushing, or anxiously trying to bring about a result, do not condemn yourself. Simply recognize the sign. The wrong I has stepped forward, and the correction is never effort against effort. The correction is remembrance, a gentle turning inward to the truth. The Father that dwelleth in me, he doeth the works. In that recognition, effort fades, not because you command it to stop, but because it has lost its purpose. The false I relaxes, and the true I is revealed as the quiet, unstoppable activity of God. If we would understand this principle beyond theory, we must look again at the life of Jesus, not as history, not as biography, but as revelation. For he did not come to show us what a superior man could accomplish. He came to reveal what happens when the personal sense of self has yielded entirely to God as the only actor. Notice carefully, there is no record of Jesus struggling to decide what to do. There is no account of him weighing possibilities, calculating outcomes, or wrestling in anxiety over results. His actions were often immediate, sometimes startlingly simple, and always exact. and yet never once did he attribute them to personal insight or power. I do nothing of myself, but as my Father hath taught me, I speak these things. This is the key. His works were effortless, but they were never careless. They were precise because they did not originate in human judgment. Precision does not come from effort. It comes from alignment. When the personal sense of I is silent, divine intelligence operates without obstruction. We must free ourselves from the mistaken belief that surrender produces vagueness or indecision. Quite the opposite is true. The more completely Jesus yielded personal will, the clearer his actions became. He could walk straight through a crowd that intended harm him. He could stop and speak to one individual while the multitudes waited. He could turn away from opportunity when it was not of God and move forward without hesitation when it was. This clarity did not come from foresight. It came from presence. Scripture tells us that Jesus often withdrew into solitude, not to plan, not to prepare speeches, not to ask what he should do next, but to rest in communion. In that resting, the personal sense of I dissolved, and the Father's activity stood revealed. This is why he could say, the Son can do nothing of himself but what he seeth the Father do. He was not watching events unfold. He was perceiving reality as God knows it. Here lies a subtle but essential distinction. Jesus did not wait passively for God to act, nor did he attempt to act for God. He lived in the awareness that God was the action. Therefore, when movement occurred, it was God moving. When words were spoken, it was God speaking. When healing appeared, it was God revealed, not God intervening. This is why Jesus never feared mistakes. Fear of error belongs only to the personal self. When one believes, I am the doer, the possibility of failure looms constantly. But when it is known, the Father that dwelleth in me, he doeth the works, there is no anxiety about outcome. God does not fail at being God. We often imagine that Jesus possessed extraordinary spiritual strength. In truth, he had relinquished the false sense of strength altogether. When I am weak, then am I strong. Weakness here does not mean frailty. It means the absence of personal assertion. And in that absence, divine authority appears not loudly, not dramatically, but irresistibly. Let us be very clear. Jesus was not guided by emotion, compassion, or urgency. He was guided by consciousness. He did not heal because someone was desperate. He healed because the Father's presence was realized. He did not speak to convince. He spoke to reveal. And this is why his words carried power. They were not personal opinions infused with faith. They were truth, uttering itself. When we attempt to imitate Jesus' actions without sharing his basis of being, we exhaust ourselves. But when we begin even faintly to see that the secret of his life was not effort, but surrender of personal doership, something shifts. We stop asking, how can I do what Jesus did? And begin to ask, what must dissolve in me for God to act as freely? And the answer is always the same, the belief in a personal I that must initiate, control, and complete life. Jesus did not demonstrate divine power. He disappeared as a personal power, and divine power stood revealed. This is why his works were effortless, and this is why they were exact. Now we come to a holy turning point, one that cannot be manufactured, only allowed. When the belief in a personal doer begins to dissolve, fear begins to lose its foundation. Fear does not die because circumstances improve. Fear dies because the one who feared is no longer believed to be in charge. Fear is not an emotion that must be overcome. Fear is a conclusion. It is the conclusion that I am responsible for life, that I must protect myself, that I must ensure survival, success, health, and continuity. The moment this I is seen through, fear has nothing left to stand on. It may still appear, but it no longer convinces. Scripture tells us, perfect love casteth out fear. This does not mean that love battles fear. It means that love reveals the unreality of fear's premise. Love divine. Love is the recognition that God is the only presence, the only power, the only life. And where God is known as all, what place can fear occupy? Observe this carefully in your own experience. Fear always speaks in the first person. What if I fail? What if I lose? What if I am harmed? Fear never says, what if God fails? For somewhere, even in the darkest hour, the soul knows that God does not fail. Fear exists only so long as responsibility is misassigned. This is why the collapse of the personal doer is not a dramatic event. It is often quiet, almost unnoticed. One simply reaches the end of self-management. One sees, sometimes through exhaustion, sometimes through insight, that striving has never produced peace. And in that moment of honesty, there is a letting go, not of effort alone, but of authorship. Jesus speaks to this directly when he says, therefore take no thought, saying, what shall we eat? Or, what shall we drink? Or, wherewithal shall we be clothed? Notice, he does not say these things will never appear. He says, your Father knoweth that ye have need of all these things. The transfer of responsibility is complete. Fear dissolves because the burden has been lifted. Now, do not mistake this for indifference. The absence of fear does not produce carelessness. It produces clarity. One still acts, still plans where appropriate, still responds to life, but without the inner tremor that says, everything depends on me. And because everything no longer depends on you, everything begins to move more freely. Many are surprised to discover that fear diminishes before circumstances change. This is the surest sign that something real has occurred. When fear vanishes without a visible reason, you may be certain that the personal doer has stepped aside and divine order is taking its place. This is why Jesus could sleep in a storm. The waves had not ceased, the wind had not stopped, but fear was absent because there was no personal self struggling to control the situation. And when he rose, he did not fight the storm. He addressed it from authority, not urgency. Peace, be still. Authority does not shout. It recognizes, let us be clear, fear does not end because you tell yourself not to be afraid. That only adds effort to fear. Fear ends when the sense of a separate self ends. And this ending is not something you accomplish. It is something you consent to. You consent to let God be God. You consent to stop pretending to be the governor of life. When this consent is given, even slightly, something sacred occurs. The mind grows quieter. The heart grows lighter. Decisions become simpler. And fear, finding no one to address, fades into silence. At this point, many earnest students ask a sincere question. If God is the doer, what becomes of planning? What becomes of intelligence, foresight, responsibility, And because this question is rarely answered clearly, some drift into confusion, while others retreat into old habits of control. Let us, then, be very precise. The Christ teaching does not abolish action. It abolishes anxiety about action. It does not forbid planning. It dissolves the belief that planning creates security. There is a subtle but vital distinction here, and until it is discerned, one may swing between strain and passivity without finding peace. Human planning begins in fear. It starts with the assumption that life is uncertain and that the personal self must prepare defenses against the unknown. It imagines future dangers, future lacks, future failures, and then attempts to arrange life so that these possibilities are controlled. This is not wisdom. It is self-protection. And self-protection always implies separation from God. Divine action, on the other hand, does not arise from anticipation. It arises from presence. It does not begin with what might happen, but with what is being revealed now. This is why Jesus never advised his students to prepare for tomorrow. Take therefore no thought for the morrow shall take thought for the things of itself. He was not denying sequence. He was denying fear-based foresight. We must understand this. God does not live in the future. God is eternally present. Therefore, divine guidance never arrives early and never arrives late. It arrives precisely when the personal self has ceased projecting itself forward in imagination. The moment we attempt to plan our way into safety, we remove ourselves from the present, where God alone is known. This does not mean that one never makes arrangements, keeps appointments, or fulfills obligations. These things still occur. But when they occur under divine government, they feel different. They are simple. They are proportionate. They are free of inner pressure. One plans, and then one rests. One acts, and then one releases. Notice how often anxiety attaches itself not to action, but to outcomes. The human self is rarely troubled by the present task. It is troubled by whether the task will succeed. This reveals immediately who is acting. God has no concern about outcomes. Outcomes are the natural expression of divine order. Only the personal self worries about results. Scripture tells us, "Commit thy works unto the Lord, and thy thoughts shall be established." It does not say, "Establish your thoughts, and God will bless them." It reverses the order entirely. When action is committed, released into God, thought finds its right place. Planning then becomes functional, not obsessive. There is a moment, subtle but unmistakable, when human planning crosses the line into interference. It is the moment when peace leaves. Whenever planning robs you of peace, you may be certain that it has ceased to be practical and has become personal. Divine action never disturbs inner stillness. If stillness is lost, authorship has been reclaimed by the false I. Many fear that without constant planning they will become careless or irresponsible. But this fear itself reveals a lack of trust in God as intelligence. God is not chaos. God is order. And when the personal self steps aside, order does not disappear. It becomes more evident. You may find, as this understanding deepens, that fewer plans are needed, not because life has become smaller, but because it has become simpler. You may notice that certain plans dissolve without effort, while others take shape effortlessly. This is not indecision, it is discernment. Jesus expressed this perfectly when he said, "The words that I speak unto you, I speak not of myself." He did not prepare sermons. He did not rehearse answers. Yet when the moment came, words appeared that no one could refute. This is divine action, complete, adequate, and timely. So we do not abandon planning. We abandon reliance upon it. We allow plans to be made, revised, or discarded without anxiety. We remain inwardly still, listening not for instructions about the future, but for awareness of God in the present. From that awareness, action flows naturally. And when action flows from God, it carries its own authority. It does not need to be defended. It does not need to be justified. It simply unfolds. Here we must pause with honesty, for this is the place where many sincere students falter, not from lack of devotion, not from lack of study, but from a subtle misunderstanding that turns practice into pressure. Spiritual practice fails at this point because it is so easily converted into a refined form of self-effort. And self-effort, no matter how sacred its language, cannot reveal God. Most spiritual disciplines begin with a beautiful impulse, the desire to know God, to live from truth, to be free from fear and limitation. But very quickly, the personal sense of I reasserts itself and asks, what must I do to make this real? And the moment that question is entertained, the practice has shifted from revelation to technique. Prayer becomes something to perform correctly. Meditation becomes something to accomplish. Truth becomes something to apply. Silence becomes something to achieve. And all of this keeps the personal self active, vigilant, and anxious, quietly monitoring its own progress. The result is often frustration masked as faithfulness. Scripture gives us a sober warning here. The letter killeth, but the Spirit giveth life. The letter of truth can be memorized, repeated, even taught, yet remain lifeless if it is used by the personal mind as a tool. The Spirit of truth is not used, it is received. And reception is impossible where effort dominates. Many approach spiritual practice as though God were a distant power to be contacted through correct procedures. They ask, am I meditating long enough? Am I surrendering deeply enough? Am I practicing recognition correctly? These questions reveal that the personal self is still trying to manage the relationship. But God is not a relationship to be managed. God is a presence to be recognized. This is why Jesus said, when ye pray, use not vain repetitions. He was not condemning words. He was exposing reliance upon them. Words do not bring God closer. Techniques do not make God more available. God is already present. The only barrier is the activity of a self that believes it must do something to reach him. And here is the great paradox. The very practices designed to awaken us can become the means by which we postpone awakening if we use them to strengthen the sense of a practicing self. The infinite way does not ask you to become a better practitioner. It asks you to become receptive. True practice is not measured by effort, duration, or consistency. It is measured by transparency. The question is not, how well am I practicing? The question is, how little am I interfering? When interference lessens, grace becomes visible. This is why some individuals with very little formal practice suddenly experience profound peace or clarity, while others, after years of discipline, feel stalled. God is not impressed by discipline. God is revealed where humility has become identity rather than attitude. The personal self always wants to do something for God. But the Christ teaching reveals that the only thing required is to stop doing for God and allow God to be still and know that I am God. Stillness is not a technique. It is the absence of interference. So when spiritual practice begins to feel heavy, strained, or burdensome, do not redouble your efforts. That only deepens the problem. Instead, become quietly alert. Ask inwardly, not verbally, who is practicing? And if the answer is, I am, then rest. Let the question dissolve without reply. For in that resting, something sacred occurs. The personal practitioner fades, and the presence stands revealed. And where the presence is revealed, practice has fulfilled its purpose and can quietly fall away. Now we come to a point where language itself becomes delicate, for words so easily distort what must be inwardly discerned. When we speak of standing still, many imagine waiting for a sign, waiting for guidance, waiting for something to happen. But standing still in the Christ sense is not waiting for God. It is resting in the certainty that God is already present. Waiting implies lack. Standing still implies fullness. Scripture says, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. Notice, salvation is not produced by movement, nor summoned by effort. It is seen, and one cannot see while running ahead in thought, projecting into the future, or rehearsing contingencies. Standing still is the quiet cessation of mental motion. But this stillness is not inert. It is alert, alive, receptive. It is the stillness of awareness, not the stillness of inertia. One is not waiting for direction. One is available to direction. One is not asking what to do next. One is acknowledging that divine intelligence is already functioning. This is why Jesus could say, my meat is to do the will of him that sent me, and yet never appear hurried. The will of God is not a schedule to be consulted. It is a flow to be recognized. And recognition occurs only when we stop anticipating. Standing still without waiting means this: you do not suspend life until guidance appears. You live fully in the present moment without mentally reaching forward to secure the next one. You allow the next step to reveal itself in its own time, which is always now. Many discover that when they stop waiting, life moves. When they stop asking, answers appear. When they stop holding the future hostage to understanding, understanding comes. This is not coincidence, it is law. The mind that waits is still projecting lack. The mind that stands still is acknowledging presence. There comes a moment quiet, almost unnoticed, when one realizes that life is no longer being pushed forward. It is being carried. This does not mean that challenges vanish or that decisions are no longer required. It means that the inner strain of propulsion is gone. Scripture speaks to this when it says, underneath are the everlasting arms. Most people read this as poetry, but to those who have tasted this truth, it is literal. There is a sense of being upheld, sustained, borne along by something that does not tire and does not hesitate. When life begins to carry you, you notice certain signs. Timing improves without calculation. Opportunities open without pursuit. Problems resolve themselves without being solved. And perhaps most striking of all, your concern about yourself diminishes. You are no longer the central project of your own life. This is not loss. It is freedom. The self that needed constant reassurance has stepped aside, and in its place stands a quiet confidence that does not explain itself. Cast thy burden upon the Lord, and he shall sustain thee. The burden was never the problem, it was the belief that you were meant to carry it. And here is something important. When life carries you, you do not feel dramatic relief. You feel normal. You feel natural. You feel as though something artificial has been removed. The sense of struggle, which once seemed inevitable, is revealed as optional and unnecessary. Now, we return once more to the statement with which we began, for it can only be understood at the end, not the beginning. I can of mine own self do nothing. At first, it sounded like limitation. Now it reveals itself as rest. Spiritual struggle ends not because you have mastered truth, but because you have stopped contending with life. You no longer wrestle with conditions, nor argue with appearances, nor battle your own thoughts. You recognize that none of these were ever your responsibility. The struggle to be spiritual ends when you realize that spirituality is not something you achieve. It is what remains when striving stops. In returning and rest shall ye be saved. In quietness and in confidence shall be your strength. Strength here is not force. It is stability. This does not make one indifferent to the world. On the contrary, it makes one more responsive, more compassionate, more effective. But these qualities are no longer labored into existence. They arise naturally, as fruit arises on the vine. At this stage, one no longer seeks spiritual experiences. One seeks only to remain transparent. One does not ask to be used by God. One simply refrains from using God. And in that refraining, divine activity becomes visible. So we come not to a conclusion, but to a resting place. There is nothing here to remember, nothing to repeat, nothing to practice as a method. There is only a sentence to live with quietly, not as a mantra, but as a listening. I can of mine own self do nothing. Do not say it. Let it say you. Let it dissolve the false sense of responsibility that has weighed so heavily. Let it stand between you and every anxious thought. Let it return you again and again to the simplicity of being. And as you live with this truth, not striving to understand it, not attempting to demonstrate it, you may find that life grows gentler. Not because circumstances obey you, but because you have stopped trying to govern what was never yours to govern. The Lord shall fight for you, and ye shall hold your peace. Hold that peace, rest in it, and allow the Father that dwelleth in you to do the works